evening, everybody, and thank you all very much for coming. As many of you will know, every year the Royal Institute of Philosophy funds a distinguished lecture in each of the 4 capital cities of the British Isles: London, Cardiff, Edinburgh, and Dublin. And tonight is the night of this year's London lecture, which is, without doubt, the highlight of the Royal Institute's annual calendar. So it's a great pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker tonight, Kwame Anthony Appiah, who's Professor of Law and Philosophy at NYU. His academic distinctions are too numerous to mention, but I'd better mention some of them. He's held academic posts at, among other places, Cambridge, Princeton, and Harvard. He's been president of the American Society for Arts and Letters. And he will be known to many of you as having delivered the Wreath Lectures for the BBC in this country in 2016. He's written on topics as wide-ranging as semantics, race and identity, and a subject neglected by almost all philosophers, honor. And he's also written a novel. Anthony, it's a great pleasure to have you with us this evening. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm honored, and I know what that means, and delighted to be here, and thank you for coming. I am not now, nor have I ever been, a Muslim, a Jew, a Hindu, or a Roman Catholic. But I have feasted at Eid al-Fitr with my Muslim cousins, celebrated Seders at home with my in-laws, recited the Sanskrit mantra as I meditated alone, and attended a nuptial mass conducted by a cardinal. Through my childhood, I sang in an Anglican school choir in England and went to Sunday school during the vacations in an interdenominational church in Ghana. And like my Ghanaian Methodist father, I have poured libations to our ancestors who were once as real to me as the God whose presence I felt when I prayed. We offered schnapps to our ancestor, the great Asante General Akramampim, and Akramampim Bejin Sanum. Akramampim, our elder, come take this alcohol and drink. As a child, I gained security from a gold cross that hung on a chain around my neck, which had been blessed by a spirit that spoke through the mediumship of a Scottish postman, who also reassured me by transmitting benevolent messages from my long-dead English grandfather. So I was in touch with my British ancestors as well, and the magic in my life was as bicultural as my ancestry. Like millions of people, I've experienced the inward peace that comes from transcendental meditation, that sense of oneness with everything that is spoken of in contemplative traditions from around the world. And once, at the end of a long season of training, rowing swiftly along the Thames near Henley, I experienced what seemed like the same sense of communion with the universe. Then, as in the daily meditations of my teenage years, I felt that the blessed Julian of Norwich, who centuries ago, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Throughout recorded history, people around the world who believed in invisible spirits, sought mystical experiences, gathered in communal rituals in buildings dedicated to the purpose, studied scriptures, lived daily lives shaped by a sense of things unseen, and had hopes and fears about a life beyond this one. It is natural to say that the prayers, the rituals and ceremonies, the beliefs and experiences I've been discussing all deserve to be called religious. They are an enormous assortment of elements, however, so it's not at all surprising that people have made a very wide range of appeals to religion in explaining human behavior. But what does it mean to assign to religion the power to explain anything? After all, as we've just seen, almost any feature of everyday life is, or at least can be, connected in a variety of ways with something we might call religion. The institutions, beliefs, and practices we call religious are so diverse that it sometimes seems there's little point in giving them all the same label. Religions are sources of identity and bearers of creed. They are associated with practices of everyday life, including performances of gender, for example. And they can bring belief and affect together in powerful ways. The anthropologist Clifford Geertz recognized in the religious traditions he studied, beginning in Indonesia, but eventually across the whole range of the Muslim world. So he ended up working in Morocco, which is about as far west as you can get in Islam, and Indonesia is about as far east. He recognized in all these religious traditions a capacity to create what he called long-lasting moods and motivations through their pictures of reality, uniting fact and feeling in powerful ways. But in the contemporary world, claims about reality are especially important signals of a class of identities, as evangelical Christians in the United States, as Hindus in India, as Jews in Israel, as Christians and Muslims in Ghana, that have become central to politics. Those labels are now associated in those four very different democracies, some teetering on the edge of democracy, with views about the nature and the role of the state. People typically express and assert these identities in part through creedal claims or through commitments to practices such as taking Holy Communion or celebrating the Sabbath on Friday dinner, or abstaining from meat in general or from pork in particular. And American conservatives, for example, are much more likely to say what is called a grace before meals than American liberals. The American political scientist Robert Putnam has a thing that he does when he gives talks. He asks people to raise their hands if they say grace, and he says, if you raise your hand, you're a conservative. And everybody nods. That's American small c conservative. And he says, unless you're black, because African Americans say grace, and African Americans typically vote for the Democratic Party. Anyway, so these creedal identities, what you might call religious identities, have gotten associated with practices of everyday life, but they've also gotten associated with politics in many places, like Hinduism in India, obviously, and Judaism in Israel, and in the country I grew up in Ghana, Christianity and Islam play roles in politics too. So I wanted to start by reminding you of this diversity of the phenomena that we might call religious. And I want now to sketch 3 elements that show up to varying degrees in different religious traditions, and to argue that disaggregating these elements can help us to understand some of the many ways in which religion can generate conflicts in societies that are now inevitably multi-religious. But I hope this disaggregation can also offer us guides to thinking about the attitudes that will allow us to resolve these conflicts, some of these conflicts. Part of the diversity of religion flows, I think, from the differences in the relative role of these different dimensions in particular religions. And so I'm going to talk about these 3 dimensions, which are creed, practice, and identity. I was raised as an Anglican, so I'll start with creed. The weekly religious services of most Christians around the world include a shared enunciation of beliefs. Assyrian, Anglican, Coptic, Eastern Syriac, Greek Orthodox, Lutheran, Roman Catholic, Russian Orthodox, and hundreds and thousands of Protestant churches pronounce a creed, usually based on the one adopted at the First Council of Nicaea in 325 of the Common Era and amended in Constantinople in 381. There are exceptions. The Unitarian Universalists, for example, who draw on Christian traditions, among others, typically describe themselves as creedless, on their websites, and so they don't say creeds at their services. And the Mormon Church, which of course thinks of itself as Christian, has a sort of creed of its own, articulating the 13 beliefs that Joseph Smith took to be central to his faith. And each of those 13 sentences begins with, "We believe," about Mormon belief, but they don't say the Nicene Creed. Still, much of the development of Christian divisions between Roman Catholics and the Oriental Orthodox Church, say, or in Western Europe between Roman Catholics and a growing number of Protestant sects after the Reformation, include disagreements about claims made in these creeds. Some divisions between Miaphysites, who hold that Christ had one nature and was both fully human and fully divine, and the Chalcedonians, who think that Christ has two natures in one person, are matters of Christological doctrine and concern beliefs that require extremely sophisticated philosophical concepts, even to entertain. I mean, you need the concept of substance to understand the dispute with the Chalcedonians. And those of you who've tried to teach Aristotle will know that not everybody finds it easy to grasp the relevant concept of substance. Indeed, I'm not sure I grasp it myself. So it seems extremely unlikely, given that most members of the churches that had these disputes, who would have been largely pre-literate and philosophically untrained, could have given an account of what the disputes were really about. Imagine someone who doesn't read Latin or Greek in the Middle Ages in Europe trying to explain to somebody else what substance is. Even university-educated Christians today are unlikely to have a grasp of the doctrines of nature and of substance that underlie these traditional disagreements. The utterance of the creed, given that, looks much less like the enunciation of propositions believed than a practice that signals membership in an institution and an identity. So I may not know exactly what substance is, but I know that I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of his Father before all worlds, and so on. And in the course of that creed, it says that he's of one substance with the Father. So I'm committed to that by the practice of uttering the creed, even though I may not know exactly what it means. Now, the creeds were developed by bishops who knew the Christian Bible with its union of Hebrew and Aramaic texts with the Koine Greek texts of the New Testament extremely well. They thought those texts, all of them, were divinely inspired and contained truth. And excerpts from both the Old and New Testaments, of course, are still read and interpreted at Christian services as often as the Creed today. Therefore, it is natural that many Christians think of having the sort of beliefs expressed in creeds and taking the scriptures seriously as enunciating truths. They think of these things as central to their commitments as Christians, at least many of them do. It's equally natural for outsiders, observing these Christian practices of enunciation, to suppose that claims made in the scriptures must be accepted by all Christians. What else could it be? They all say this stuff. So, for Jews and Muslims too, scriptures are central to communal religious services and to individual lives. Learning the Quran by heart and studying the Torah are highly regarded practices in their respective traditions. And a well-known hadith tells us that the Prophet said, "The best among you are those who learn the Quran and teach it," and that means learn by heart. And you want to please your family in many countries in the world today as a young person, actually as a young boy, you can start trying to learn the Quran by heart. And it's especially impressive in those countries where Arabic is not a language of everyday life. And there are lots of Somali kids who can recite the Quran. So many people today, including many people who claim religious identities, think of scriptures as fixing what a religion requires of its adherents, adopting a kind of scriptural determinism that claims that religious people must be bound by what is in the texts they revere. Christians and Muslims in Ghana, for example, seem largely convinced that they must condemn homosexuality because the scriptures do. These arguments assume, as I said, a kind of scriptural determinism. If this is your scripture, you must believe what it says and act upon it. Nevertheless, many contemporary people in the North Atlantic world who claim Jewish, Christian, Muslim, or Hindu identity actually don't know very much about any scriptural tradition. When I first went to teach in the United States, I would from time to time find it useful to make reference to biblical passages or characters because I had been told I was coming to a Christian country. And I just got a lot of stares. So similarly, once male Jews who would have studied the Torah regularly, and nowadays many people who identify as Jews don't really even study the proportion of it that they interpret for their bar mitzvahs, when they're calls of the Torah, as they pass from child to adult. American Hindus, like many Hindus in South Asia, aren't very likely to know Sanskrit or to be able to tell you more than a few of the thousands, tens of thousands of tales in the rich body of ancient Hindu religious writings. Devout Muslims may study the Quran, but most are not schooled in interpreting the transcribed oral traditions, the hadith, that report the doings and sayings of the Prophet and his companions and define the Sunnah, the example given by the life of the Prophet and his companions. So it may be worth pointing out that some of the features that are common to these scriptural writings, since the determinist argument requires us to evaluate claims about their interpretation. So first, much scriptural language, as those of you who have any acquaintance with any scriptures will know, is poetical. It invites us to read it as metaphor. It uses language of the sort that we're familiar with in poetry, which we're expecting to read as metaphor. If the Lord is my shepherd, that does not mean that I'm literally a sheep. And we know that without being told. We read it as metaphor. A metaphor more resonant for those of us who actually do keep sheep like myself, but intelligible perhaps to everybody. Another thing about scriptures is that when they do offer practical guidance, it's often very abstract. The advice about how to live. So, for example, most Europeans, I think, believe that Muslim men may have up to 4 wives. But what the Surah Al-Nisa actually says is this: if you fear you cannot act fairly towards the orphans, then marry the woman you like, 2 or 3 or 4. But if you fear that you will not be fair, then 1, or whatever you already have. That makes it more likely that you avoid bias. The stuff at the start about orphans has to do with the things, mistreatment of orphans in pre-Islamic Arab culture, and I won't try to explain why that's in there. But the basic thought here is, addressed to a culture in which men, prosperous men could have many more wives than 4, addressed to that culture, this seems like advice to limit the number of wives you have rather than to expand it. And in fact, given human nature and the challenge of fairness, it might naturally be read as an encouragement to have only one wife. That makes it more likely that you will avoid bias, right? I mean, only a fool will be confident that he can be fair to 4 wives. All right, so the point is, how to get from that to a view about whether I should marry a second wife is a complicated question. It's not obvious how I get from one to the other. I should say, in my case, it would be a husband, but never mind. And my current husband would have a lot to say about that. Because scriptures are often seen as a single whole, serious readers see each passage in the light of all the others. They engage in a holistic interpretation. They try to seek a coherent account that makes the best sense of all the parts. So let me give a Christian example. Nothing is clearer than that the book of Leviticus permits the perpetual enslavement of Gentiles, even while it insists that Jews whose labor has been bought must be released from obligation in the year of Jubilee that comes every 50 years. St. Paul in the New Testament tells slaves that they should obey their masters with fear and trembling as unto Christ. In between, the Bible mentions slavery hundreds of times, sometimes imposing limits on how slaves should be treated, but nowhere rejecting slavery as such. It's not any particular text, but the body of scriptural discussion of slavery as a whole that is likely to seem important to a contemporary Christian. Still, surely then, Christians are bound to accept slavery. Well, the campaigns against the British slave trade in the Atlantic were begun first by very, very serious committed Christians, by Quakers and other evangelicals. And no mainstream Christian denomination accepts slavery today. As long ago as 1537, Pope Paul III, long before the rise of the Atlantic slave trade, forbade the enslavement of Indians in the Americas. This is a quote from an encyclical. Indians and all other people who may later be discovered by Christians are by no means to be described of their liberty or the possession of their property, even though they be outside the faith of Jesus Christ, nor should they be in any way enslaved. That's a Catholic pope in the 16th century, before the rise of the Atlantic slave trade. So, a Martian reading the Christian scriptures would predict the opposite, would not predict a pope telling us that slavery is wrong. Scriptures survive in part precisely because they aren't just lists of beliefs or instructions how to live. And the point here is that the passages that explicitly mention slavery, the point about the contextual character of the interpretation of these scriptures, they're going to be read in the light of other passages that treat of how people in general should be treated, whatever their status. So as Pope Gregory XVI put it in condemning slavery in the 19th century, in 1839, quote, "But as the law of the gospel universally and earnestly enjoined a sincere charity towards all, and considering that our Lord Jesus Christ had declared that he considered as done or refused to himself everything kind and merciful done or refused to the small and needy, it naturally follows not only that Christians should regard that Christians should regard their slaves as brothers." The point is that the story of sacred texts has always been the story of their readers, and it's involved shifting and clashing interpretations. Most readers want their interpretation to be the whole everlasting truth, but objective observers from outside can see that religions, like everything else that are important in human life, evolve. And some observers within these traditions celebrate these developments as a sign of a deepening understanding of their faith. To the extent that that development occurs in dialogue with other religious traditions they live among, it's possible, as collaboration and comity develop, to move towards interpretations that fit better with the interpretations of people of other religions around you. This is something that has happened with the Abrahamic traditions in the United States. Despite the evident liturgical differences, much that you will see in some synagogues in Manhattan seems very like what goes on in some Protestant churches nearby, including stained glass windows and pews and all kinds of things in the built architecture of synagogues and churches. Nevertheless, we can see why reasons of scriptural traditions taken seriously at a particular place and time can generate conflict. Christians have often thought that a kind of beliefs, the kind they call faith in English, can be a morally worthy achievement, even a source of justification, so important that it might be rewarded with eternal life. And if faith is virtuous, infidelity will be a vice. So while the penalties imposed on unbelief by the Holy Inquisition included many forms of penance, thousands of people were burned to death in Europe and the Americas between the beginnings of the institution in France in the 12th century through to its eventual abolition at the beginning of the 19th century. Likewise, apostasy, turning away from orthodoxy, particular from monotheism, is a capital offense in Sharia. And while diverting from practices like abstaining from pork or speaking blasphemously or mistreating the Quran could be a sign of apostasy, apostasy is at heart a matter of unbelief. Nevertheless, there aren't a lot of contemporary executions for apostasy, though there are many Muslim states, though there are significant numbers of extrajudicial killings in a few Muslim societies today, which are directed at people for infidelity. This focus on mistaken belief as not an error, but a vice, not an epistemic vice, but a moral vice, is very much internal to particular religious traditions, however. There's no similar concern for purity of creed in many places outside the Abrahamic traditions. The first commandment, acknowledged by Jews and Christians and Muslims, is, "You shall have no other gods before me." But for many polytheistic traditions, from Hinduism to the traditional religions of Ashanti, where I grew up, there is no sense that anyone should focus their worship, their faith, on a particular divinity or worry much about niceties of doctrine. In 19th century Ashanti, I doubt anyone would have claimed to know the whole truth about the gods or the ancestors or any other spiritual beings, nor would they have worried much about what anyone else believed or devoted a lot of energy to forming a precise picture of spiritual matters. The late Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe once said to me, "My ancestors would not have traveled 3,000 miles to tell anybody they were wrong." He was thinking about the missionaries who had come to his grandparents. As for proper worship, my ancestors would only have cared if mistaken practices by family and neighbors brought the wrath of various spirits, ancestral or not, down on their community. All right, so much for creed. As far as practice goes, much of the religious material I mentioned at the start is not about thinking things or believing things, it's about doing things. A Jewish Seder is a ceremony which can be engaged in today by people who have almost any creedal commitments, including atheism. The Catholic marriage service I mentioned was attended by friends of the bride and groom who were undoubtedly not Roman Catholic. So much so that the presiding Cardinal Archbishop began his homily by saying, "As many of you may know, I'm not married myself," implying that he had an audience that might include people unaware of basic facts about Catholic practice. And many variations in practice can enable you to recognize others as members of your particular denomination or form of worship, or as interlopers from another. Consider what Muslims do with their forefinger during prayer. When you're uttering the tashahhud, when you offer praise to God and peace to the Prophet, and you bear witness that there is no God but Allah. Sunnis tend to lift their index finger during this, and Sunni clerics class this with actions that are recommended, but not compulsory. The general thought, I think, is that pointing indicates the greatness of the one whom you're addressing. Yet how and when people point differs from one school to another, even from one congregation to another. Differences of practice like this are not illegal Muslim by any means. WikiHow offers instructions on how Christians may cross themselves, making the sign of the cross in their bodies, in the Western and Eastern traditions of the Church. But you'll need more than a single website to discover when you should cross yourself, according to the various traditions that permit or require it. And Protestants, other than some Anglicans, Methodists, and Lutherans, tend not to do it at all, tend not to cross themselves. No regard. In many places, if you do that in church, they'll know that you're not one of them. Much ritual practice floats free of specific beliefs and signifies identities. But that doesn't mean it can't lead to conflict. Within communities, there is often the kind of fierce debate about practice that there is about these questions about ritual practice in prayer among Sunni Muslims. But across communities, differences in practices seem to me to be significant largely as signs of different identities. It's not conflicts over practice as such, so much as conflicts between groups of differing identities, where the practical differences are signals of which identity you have. And I'll discuss a bit of this, an argument about this in a minute. However, the most obvious place where practical disagreements can lead to conflict between groups of different religious identities is, of course, where ethical ideas about universal principles of behavior or about universal values more generally, are associated with particular religious beliefs. To the extent that an ethical claim is founded on a metaphysical belief that's not shared across religious identities, there'll be no basis in shared beliefs to appeal to in settling such disagreements. To the extent, for example, that a belief about the wrongness of abortions is grounded in the idea that the embryo has a soul from the moment of conception, there are not likely to be ways of coming to agreement with those who don't believe in souls about how embryos or fetuses should be treated. Similarly, a general ethical commitment to the welfare of animals, whether or not it's grounded in religious identity, can come into conflict with religious ideas about animals, about how animals ought to be treated. The general respect for cattle in Hinduism, or the objection to animal killing for human use of many ethical vegans, can come into conflict with the idea of kosher or halal foods, or the practice of animal sacrifice in many African traditions, and in Haitian voodoo, where sacrificing chickens is a regular ritual practice, since these last presuppose that certain forms of animal treatment are a matter of religious obligation, even if they may look cruel. And I want to say something about one example of this sort of thing at the end. I'll close with an example. But before doing that, let me turn to the last of the three things I said was important in thinking about religion, and that's identity, which I've already mentioned, of course, already. Each person's sense of self is bound to be shaped by their own family background, but there are also larger identities that are clearly important. Gender, our religion case, but also nation, race, class, and various cultural identities. So why do all these things matter, and what on earth do they have in common? In thinking about religious identities, it helps, I think, to begin with the things that these very disparate formings of grouping people do have in common. So to start with a general account of identity before focusing in on religious identities in particular. The first general point about identities, in my view, under-recognized, and it's that identities require labels. And understanding an identity requires that you know how to apply some sign or marker of identity. Then you can look for someone of that identity or try to decide of someone you meet whether the label applies to them. Often, people disagree about the boundaries here. Mustafa Topal, a Dane of Kurdish ancestry, wrote a piece in Dagbladet Information a while back, a Danish newspaper, headed Danskheid, that is, being Danish, has become a national religion that one cannot convert to. So there's apparently a dispute in Denmark about whether a person of Kurdish origin can really be Danish. But of course, that's possible only because there's consensus about a lot of cases, a lot of central cases. So all the Danes I know are undoubtedly Danish. Nobody doubts their Danishness. So that's the first point. You need the labels, but there's contest about how to apply them. The second point is that membership in an identity group helps shape the thoughts and feelings and the doings of people who bear a label. It creates what I've sometimes called norms of identification, ideas about how you should behave given your identity. We act as people, as Americans, as Catholics, as gay people, and so on. And that's because we have ideas about how, given the fact that we have this identity, we should behave. Now, one of the commonest ways in which identity matters is that we feel some sort of solidarity with people with whom we share an identity. So our common identity gives us a reason, we think, to care about and to help one another. But just as there's usually conflict or contest about the boundaries of the group, there's about who's in and who's out, about whether a Kurd can be Danish, there's almost always disagreement about what normative significance of identity is. What does being British or being a woman require of you? There's no consensus on that. So individual Britons and individual English women will sometimes do things because they're women. They'll think of themselves as women and that'll shape their behavior. But that law isn't necessarily what should it by them the other way, or all the other Britons. And finally, there's another feature that all these identities share. Your identity doesn't just give you reason to do things, it typically gives other people reason to do things to you. Among the most significant things people do with identities is use them as the basis of hierarchies of status and respect and structures of power. So in many places in the world, one ethnic or religious group regards its members as superior to others and assumes the right to better treatment, often including from the state. So, to summarize all this in 3 sentences, identities come with labels and ideas about why and to whom they should be applied. Your identity shapes your thoughts about how you should behave and affects the way other people treat you. And all these dimensions of identity are contestable. They're up for dispute, who's in, what they're like, and how they should behave and be treated. Each of these 3 things is emphatically true of religious identities today. Yes, there are labels, Roman Catholic, Sunni, and there are disputes about how to apply them. There are some people who think that the person you think of as the Pope isn't the Pope. There's another guy who claims to be Pope. I forget what, I think he's in France. You can follow him on Instagram. Yes, for most people who claim a religious identity, they think that commits them to some courses of action, perhaps also to some beliefs. But there's a great deal of disagreement about which actions and which beliefs. The Anglican Church, in which I grew up, is divided now between those who believe their faith requires them to accept LGBT people and those who believe it requires their condemnation. Some Ahmadiyya Muslims, who are not regarded as Muslim at all by some Sunni and Shia authorities, believe that there is no earthly punishment appropriate for apostasy. And yes, how people of one religious identity treat each other, and treat people of other religious identities varies enormously. Religious identities, like others, shape solidarities. People align themselves with those whose identities they share. If a religious identity engages you with a group of people with whom you share such practices as prayer and worship, they will be able to call on you to assist them. And your ethical commitments may be associated in your mind with a religious identity and tradition, even though they are perfectly generic normative commitments that could be, and in fact are, shared by people of many other religious identities. But that an ethical precept is associated in the mind of its followers with the religious identity is no reason to doubt that it can be followed by people of other religious identities, or none. All right. So I've distinguished between belief, creeds, practice, and identity. But in obvious ways, as we've seen, each interpenetrates the others. The declaration of belief, as I said, is a form of practice, where the creed is a practice as well as an utterance with some kind of assoteric content. I'm reminded of an example in one of Gore Vidal's novels set in the ancient world of a bunch of priests who are saying prayers. I guess they were Greek-speaking, but in some other earlier language. And they don't actually know what the prayers mean, but they know that they have to utter them. Some beliefs, not least ethical ones, enjoin certain practices. Well, the meaning of a practice can be shaped by the beliefs it entrains. If someone takes a knife to you, her beliefs determine whether it's assault or surgery. And of course, Communities define themselves by and through practices and beliefs, identities. That's one reason that differences in beliefs define sects, even if they don't really create them in any straightforward way. Protestantism began with dissatisfaction about the practices of the Roman Catholic Church, but ended with differences in doctrine and in practice. That, too, is how Methodism broke off from the Anglican Church. I was raised in the Anglican Church, but I was baptized a Methodist, so I know about these distinctions. But when we find conflicts that seem to be on the basis of religion, I think it can be worth trying to figure out whether what is at their heart is conflicts over creeds, over practices, or over identities, to get to my point. So I want to end with a necessarily oversimplified example where I'll argue that having these distinctions helps us think about a case that is currently causing a lot of trouble in the world.
There's no doubt that many of the Sanskritic traditions of South Asia
show a particular reverence for cows, as well as a more general tendency toward avoiding the consumption of animal flesh. Not all Hindus are vegetarians or vegan, of course, but many were and are. In Jain traditions, this reverence for animal life extends to insects, and the avoidance of harm to all animals, including, of course, humans, is a vital part of Jain practice. The ideal of ahimsa, avoiding violence to all creatures, is central to Buddhism as well. But it comes out of these Sanskritic traditions. So, as a matter of creed, cows are sacred and non-violence towards all creatures is commended. And yet the Bhagavad Gita is a Sanskrit scripture in which the god Krishna advises Arjuna, a warrior prince, that it is his dharma, his ethical duty, to participate in a war with his cousins about which he has doubts. Because this text presupposes that a war can be just, it cannot be said to be committed to non-violence. Still, the veneration for cattle, especially for milk-bearing cows, which symbolize motherhood, generosity, and non-violence, is present in both ancient Sanskrit texts like the Mahabharata and in Hindu practice, and their slaughter has been widely condemned among Hindus in modern times as well. Indeed, the fact that Muslims killed and ate cows was one of the focuses of anti-Muslim sentiment in communal riots over the last century or more, and was a crucial element of the communal violence that led to the partition of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, East Pakistan. The association of cows with various divinities, with motherhood, and with Hinduism itself means that for many Hindus, the avoidance of harm to cows is one of those long-lasting moods and motivations that Geertz spoke about. Hinduism conceives of reality in a way that makes the practices and norms associated with particular strands of Hindu tradition appear especially fitting, or as Geertz puts it, uniquely realistic. So beliefs, practices, and identity all cohere to make this issue especially salient in the lives for whom Hindu, the label, is a modern religious identity. Insofar as scriptures go, Hinduism has a very large pool on which to draw. The two largest Sanskrit epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata, contain some 2.25 million words. There are also the 4 Vedas and the Upanishads. Composed over more than a millennium, beginning in the 2nd millennium BCE, they are enormously diverse in their language, form, and content. And it's not surprising that out of these sources and the hundreds of commentaries on them, it's possible to draw a very wide range of views on many topics. Still, hardly anyone denies that many in India came early to respect for the cow, or that respect is associated with most Hindus today. And part of the point, of course, is that this can't have been invented in order to motivate hostility to Muslims, because some of these texts were written before there were any Muslims, before Islam began. So that can't possibly be the explanation. For the Muslims of South Asia, on the other hand, beef eating is a normal practice, if you can afford it, provided the animals have been properly slaughtered. So is the tanning of cowhides and the wearing of leather goods. But as usual with religious identities, there are exceptions. There are some Sufi vegetarians. The handling of dead cattle and their hides is also one of the many practices regarded as unclean by most Hindus, and so it is consigned, along with other unclean practices, to the Dalits, to the people who were once called untouchables. As a result, the workers in India's leather industry are largely Muslims, problem, or Dalits, for whom it's part of their assigned role. The Indian Council for Leather Exports claims, quote, that the export of footwear, leather, and leather products from India was to the tune of US 5.26 billion during 2022-23. And in 2022, India exported $2.2 billion worth of beef. So on the one hand, the majority of Indians revere cattle, and on the other, India is home to an industry that exports billions of dollars worth of goods made from dead cattle, even though the BJP attempted to ban the sale of cattle for slaughter in 2017 in a decision that was reversed by the Indian Supreme Court. Against this background, attacks on people suspected to be involved in the slaughter of cattle are largely going to be attacks on Muslims and Dalits. And since both of these groups are regarded with hostility by many of India's Hindus, it'll be hard to distinguish these attacks from casteism and Islamophobia, both of which we'll see as religiously motivated. This is all the more obvious given that while the cow is of enormous symbolic significance in India, there's a good deal of evidence that many ordinary Hindus don't actually have a deep concern for their welfare. A study of some farms, 28 farms with 571 cows, to sound like a social scientist, in Kerala, published in 2020, showed that almost all of them were treated in ways that violate contemporary norms of animal welfare elsewhere. Now, that's an infinitesimal fraction of India's over 60 million dairy cattle, but there's no reason to think that this was unrepresentative. There's no doubt that discussion of the welfare of cattle in India is therefore strongly affected by the association of the cattle slaughtering Dalits and Muslims, groups defined by religious ideas, though also, of course, by ideas of status that float free of particular religious claims. The recent attacks on Muslims associated with the protection of cattle are clearly, at least in part, reflections of Islamophobia or hostility to Muslims as Muslims. But the concern for the welfare of cattle among Hindus is not something that was invented, as I said, in order to persecute Muslims, and there's equally no doubt that much of that concern is genuine. Nor, finally, should we overstate the scale of this violence, as people sometimes do. Even if communal violence affects many more people than those who are killed by it, I can't find evidence of more than 50 such deaths in India in the last decade. Now, I've been arguing that it helps to distinguish matters of creed, practice, and identity. In pursuing this issue, there's an important creedal distinction, an intellectual distinction between a concern for animal welfare and a prohibition on causing the death of animals. Hindus generally believe in the idea of karma and that souls are born and reborn in all living things, as do most Buddhists. They also tend to think that each creature's life has a natural end. As a result, killing an animal is an interference in the natural order and affects a soul that may one day be embodied in a human being and then, if it's lucky, released from the so-called rebirth. So not only is it wrong, according to general principles of ahimsa, to cause harm to animals, it's also wrong to kill them, even if you do so without causing suffering to them. But there's a further question whether in killing a cow, one interferes with its ascent through many lives to the possibility of release from samsara, the cycle of birth and rebirth. If there is no such karmic harm when one kills an animal, no harm to the animal, then the person harmed by the killing is the killer. It burdens their karma, not anybody else's. And in that case, in the painless killing of an animal, one harms only oneself. That being so, the question whether one ought to punish someone who painlessly kills an animal could be answered in the negative. And that is how Gandhi, for example, answered that question. After all, the law of karma will guarantee a negative cost to the wrongdoer without the state doing anything. While Muslims have no reason to think that killing cows is wrong in itself, there is a clear Islamic basis for a concern for animal welfare. Because there's, I'm just going to quote one hadith, obviously, where there's one, there are more, but which is, I forget whose translation this is, but it's a bit of an old-fashioned translation. Verily, Allah has enjoined kindness in all things, so when you kill, kill with kindness, and when you slaughter, slaughter with kindness. Let one of you sharpen his blade and spare the animal his sorted from suffering. So it's just a hadith that says that it's okay to eat animals, but it's not okay to cause suffering in the course of killing them. So you must kill them as quickly and painlessly as you can. So it seems to me that on creedal grounds, there's the possibility of an agreement with Hindus that cruelty to animals is wrong, but that the painless slaughter of beef cattle should be permitted to Indian Muslims. Apple, is there, come. Which, of course, the Muslims don't believe in. Settling that, though, would involve complex and shortly disputed questions about how karma works exactly. Okay, this is a very primitive and preliminary discussion of the doctrinal or creedal questions behind the struggles going on in India between Hindus and non-Hindus over the treatment of cattle. But if we turn from creedal questions to matters of practice, there's nothing at all to stop all parties agreeing that they will follow their different practices, with Muslims and some Dalits eating beef and many Hindus refusing to do so. And on the identity front, there has never been any reason for Indian Hindus to be hostile to Muslims on grounds of identity, for the Sanskritic traditions of India have a long practice of accepting a great diversity of religious identities. Indeed, many in the past would have thought that it was a matter for people, or perhaps communities, to find their way to a practice that makes sense to them, drawing on the vast range of ritual and the many gods associated with Hinduism. There's a conventional Hindu saying that there are 33 crore, that is, bless you, that is 330 million gods. That's an awful lot of gods to choose among, and you can't follow them all. Furthermore, the general practice of ahimsa suggests that even if you think that the way another person practices is wrong, violence against them is the wrong solution. Though the issue for people of the Kshatriya ruling warrior caste is different because, as I mentioned earlier, they're entitled to use force in the conduct of their duties. This is one reason why Buddhists often think of the Kshatriya caste as having a problem, because it's their duty to do something that will burden their karma, namely, of course, suffering to others. I pursue this discussion as one in which the resolution at creedal level for such disputes depends on every party seeking to understand the other's creedal commitments and finding an agreement where possible that is consistent with all of them. This requires a kind of goodwill that is not common. If one is already hostile to people of another identity, it will be tempting to hold to creedal interpretations that reduce the possibility of just these compromises. But the creed-based resolution here depends on taking a pluralist view about religious identities, a view according to which each community, and perhaps in the end each person, must be allowed to find their own way in matters of religious identity. This, which in my view is the core of the liberal and the cosmopolitan attitude, is not hard to find. It's not hard to find evidence of that attitude, that pluralist attitude, in Hindu practice over the centuries, even though that might not be obvious looking at India right now. Notice, though, that what I am saying here has nothing to do with any kind of relativism. I can think that my way is correct and still think that you should be allowed to live by your way, even though it is incorrect. As the Quran says, let there be no compulsion in religion, for the truth stands out clearly from falsehood. So whoever renounces false gods and believes in Allah has certainly grasped the firmest, unfailing handhold. This passage affirms the truth of Islam while still refusing to compel others to it. Okay, I've spent just a few minutes on an issue that would require millions of conversations among thoughtful Hindus and Muslims and others in India to come to a satisfactory resolution. My aim was just to suggest that having available to us the distinction between creed, practice, and identity can be helpful in reflecting on conflicts grounded in religion. And I encourage you to see if mobilizing this set of distinctions works with the many other examples of religious conflict that we see around us in the world today. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I've read most of your work in the past about identity, so I'm obviously seeing it in relation to that. And it seemed to me that some of that work, thinking particularly the ethics of identity, regards some of how identity plays out in contemporary societies as a problem. You talk wonderfully about the Medusa syndrome, where people become trapped in identities that should have been about liberation. So I wonder how much of what you're talking about today is particular to religion, and how is that different from some other ways that identity works in society today?
Thank you. And thank you for reading my book, or books. Well, one special thing about some religions, and I've been trying to encourage us to think of them as not all being the same and being different degrees of importance for creed and practice and identity in different religions. But one thing that characterizes the religions that are most familiar in Europe, namely the Abrahamic religions, is the centrality of these texts and of claims about reality to them. Claims about reality that are such that your attitude to people who don't accept them is not, oh, well, that's what they think, but they're bad because you shouldn't think things like that. That's not true, generally speaking, about identities. It's not generally speaking true about, say, national identities, that they're associated with commitments, creedal commitments, or commitments to the idea that there's some body of text in which the truth is sort of grounded. And again, I think around political identities, I mentioned that there are practices now in many countries which people engage in ways that seem to reflect political identities. That was the example of saying prayers, saying graces before meals in the United States among Christians. Turns out that's now a conservative practice, a practice that signals a conservative political identity. Well, but generally speaking, there aren't a lot of things, practice-type things of that sort that are associated, especially with a lot of modern political identities. And that's because many of the modern political identities are new. I'm older than Ghana. So you couldn't have been a Ghanaian patriot when I was born. You couldn't even have been a patriot of the Gold Coast, because when I was born in the Gold Coast, because in 1957, when Ghana was created, it was created out of two territories, not one. The Gold Coast, well, actually more than two. The Gold Coast, the Asante Protectorate, the Northern Territories, and Western Togoland, which was taken from the Germans in 1918, along with the rest of their colonies, and divided between the British and the French, and the part that became British joined Ghana, and the part that spoke French became Togo, modern Togo. But that was the result of a referendum, again, after I was born. So you couldn't have known that that was going to happen at the time. Anyway, but and most modern states are like that. They have boundaries that are relatively recent, and they don't have histories of practice associated, therefore, with them in the sort of way that you might think for some older political identities, maybe like British identity, there might be things that people might claim. For example, people might think of Anglicanism as somehow central to British identity, or might have thought that. There are people who think that cricket is central to British identity, and there are other people who think that soccer is, even though they know that there are other people who play soccer elsewhere, and they know that there are people who play cricket elsewhere, and unfortunately occasionally beat us. So I think that the idea that there are ritual practices associated with national identity is not really there are not a lot of good examples of that. You could argue that in Japan there are ritual practices associated with Japaneseness, having weddings in Shinto temples and having funerals in Buddhist temples is a kind of thing about Japanese people. But that means knowing Shinto and Buddhist ritual in order to be a good Japanese person. But for most modern nations, I don't think it's true that there are a lot of ritual practices that are associated in a deep way with national identity. So again, that's a difference, though, these differences are always to be mentioned while bearing in mind the great diversity within national and religious identities. So I just gave an example of a national identity which might be associated with ritual practice, but we can think of religious identities that aren't associated with much ritual practice. I mean, the Quakers got to be called Quakers because they quaked, but now they just sit there. And then people pop up from time to time and say things, anything they like, right? That's barely a ritual practice. So what am I saying? I'm saying that identities, it's interesting that we can generalize about identities because they're very diverse. and religious and national identities are very diverse. And again, gender is not particularly associated either with belief or with ritual practices. In our kind of society, it may have been associated with ritual practices in some societies in the past, but it's not. Most of those were connected with religion as well as with gender. So, So I don't think. So I think if you want to talk about specific kinds of identity, you have to sort of dig into their particularities in order to think about them especially when they're causing problems. You need to figure out exactly how they're working and what the source of the problem is. And what I was suggesting about the current Indian situation is that if you really cared about solving the problem, you would have to dig into questions about what a possible Hindu attitude is to the question of the harm you do to a cow when you kill it, for example. I mean, that seems to me, and that is the question on which this society is divided, right? There are people who think that it's okay to eat meat as long as you don't, you aren't cruel in the lives that the animals have or in the deaths that you give them, and there are people who think it's wrong to kill them, so it doesn't matter how nice their lives are.
Thank you very much. That was predictably wonderful. I have a worry, however.
I'll be happy if we only have one.
When you say, why do religions divide us, I presume that you are presuming that they do. And one might object because that is a substantial claim. Yeah. And it's entirely plausible, especially with the example that you gave in the end, that there is some, common cause of the structural elements of the religions as you describe them, and the divisions that we see in society, like tribalism, or there are lots of things, of things that could be responsible for both of those.
Yes.
And so, what is the justification?
Good. So That's in the title, but in the talk, I was interested in cases where there is a conflict in the world in which the sides have different religious identities. At the beginning, I expressed skepticism or raised the question about whether it makes sense to speak of religion as causing anything. Particular features of the religious lives of particular communities might get involved in an explanation of the difficulties over political divides. But the general, there is a general thing to be said about the mobilization of identities in politics, right? Which doesn't just mean religious identities. It means lots of kinds of identities. You mentioned tribalism. Ethnic identities are often mobilized in this sort of way. And there's a sort of, as it were, political theory answer to this, which is that identities mobilize and motivate, and therefore political leaders have reasons, or other kinds of community people have reasons to mobilize political identities in order to pursue political aims. And that works. I mean, that's a feature of our identity psychology, which is nothing special about religious identities. Namely, that you can use powerful social identities to generate in-group, out-group antagonisms, and you can use out-group antagonism to generate in-group solidarity. That's a general thing across the cases. And that fact, the fact that you can do that, and that politics is in part about mobilizing people to do things together, means that people will mobilize identities to do that. Now, there's a class of identities that have been created for the purpose of politics, namely Republican, Democrat, Tory, Socialist, and so on, those party-type identities. And those are typically associated with historically, with some sort of picture of society, some view about. So, socialism is a view about the state being the primary actor in the domain of property. That's not a very sexy thing, and so socialism comes with some sexier things as well. But that's kind of the definitional thing. And conservatism is about not having too much change from the way things were, that kind of thing. But in those, apart from those which were made for politics, other identities which weren't made for politics, but which live elsewhere, get mobilized in politics all the time. So that's the way I see religious practices, beliefs, and identities being used. They're being used by political actors to create solidarities that can then be used to pursue state power. So if there's something special about religions, it's that they have this combination of practice and belief and identity that makes that mobilization occur in a specific set of kinds of ways, which include by articulating differences between groups of people in terms of what they believe about things. Now, that's the beliefs there are kind of signs of identity, as I said. For Christian purposes, the Nicene Creed has been a sign of identity. I argued that it wasn't clear to me that it was also a sign of any deep beliefs, because large parts of the creed are not intelligible, I think, unless you have the kind of philosophical training that most people have never had. I mean, there's a question about whether they're intelligible at all, but they're certainly not intelligible unless you you have the relevant concepts, and the relevant concepts are philosophical concepts. So I don't know if that's responsive to your anxiety.
It's a subtly different play, right? Because religions dividing us versus somebody mobilizing religions or capitalizing on the structural features of religion in order to divide us are different.
Yes, they are. And as I said, it says that in the title, and it's my title. I'm not assigning responsibility to anybody else. But the argument was essentially more about how the features of religious identities make them have a special role in the world, which shows up in the fact that in many places in the world today, religions are identity markers between groups that are in political conflict. In Sri Lanka, this country, obviously, we're familiar with Ireland, where Protestant Catholic is a historical and important example of this phenomenon. Now in India today, the distinction between Hindus and Muslims being mobilized for these purposes. Obviously, the distinction between Jews and non-Jews is important in what's going on in Palestine and so on. But in a way, you're underlining something that I sort of was thinking but didn't articulate clearly enough at the start when I asked whether religion could explain anything. It's not. I'm not really saying, as it were, these divisions exist because the religions exist. I'm saying religions have these features, and when they're mobilized politically, these features have to be understood in order to think about how they operate in politics. But all of the traditions I've mentioned, Hinduism, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, in all of these cases, they have also powerfully, historically, been on the side of being against conflict and being for being pacific and so on.
Thank you. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Nicholas Nassim Taleb's intransigent minority, thesis, but there seems to be breeding resentment when restaurants, for example, find it easier to just make everything halal than to make separate halal and non-halal. There's a reason why there's a halal badge and not a counterpart haram badge, I guess. And I guess there could be like the Michaela schools and just force everyone all the students to eat vegetarian. But of course, if your KFC and your bread and butter, so to speak, is chicken, you can't really do that, right? So I'm just wondering, in cases like these, when you have this, colliding, and not just to pick on Muslims. I mean, there's various levels of kashrut. There's my Hindu classmate once who refused to eat even vegetarian food unless it was prepared in an entirely vegetarian kitchen. So how do we deal with this as cosmopolitanism and migration brings more of these completely incompatible dietary restrictions and marital compatibilism, those kinds of things in contact with one another, and in time of increasing nativism and all of that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, so you can. The problem with one general anthropological remark about dietary differences, which is that it very often looks as though their historical function was to maintain distance between the people with one dietary practice and the people with another. This was forcefully brought home to me some years ago when a very distinguished and extremely observant Jewish philosopher, I invited him to dinner at our house, and he basically said, I don't think that's going to be possible because I only eat stuff prepared in a kosher kitchen, and I'm not going to force you to kosherize your kitchen. Now, I have Jewish guests at my dinner table all the time, so it's only some, in fact, very few Jews these days who would worry about that. So the question is, so one observation you might make is that, as it were, some Jews are more relaxed about this than others, some Hindus are more relaxed about vegetarianism than others, some Muslims are more relaxed about exactly how halal everything has to be in the kitchen and so on. And we can ask ourselves the question, what's the explanation for the difference between the ones who, as it were, don't find difficulty coming to dinner with a person of another set of practices and the ones who do? It's arguable, I think, that in the contemporary world, one of the reasons people insist on these sorts of things is political. It has to do with their desire to shape the world around their religious identity. And I don't mean that your hyper-observant Hindu friend who won't eat anything except out of a kitchen that's never seen any organisms except plants. I don't mean that he's consciously thinking, I want to shape the world to my thing. But I think there's a sort of impulse, especially among people who are holding on to a religious tradition in the contemporary world when it feels harder to do that. And so they're kind of, it matters to them and they find it harder to do, not really because of the other religions around, but just because their own community is less seriously observant in many ways than it used to be. And so they're sort of anxious about that. What you can do in terms of living with people is not something about which one can have a general theory. It depends on what they're like. And for example, we no longer have to worry about offending believers in the Norse gods. So you can call your god, your dog, Odin, and you won't upset anybody. But if there were serious believers in the Norse gods around, you'd have to think, right? Do I want to be shouting Odin at my dog in a public park? Because I might be upsetting somebody, right? In other words, what cosmopolitan cohabitation requires is attentiveness to the actual character of the differences in a particular community, and a willingness on the part of most people to be a little bit relaxed about them. And if you've got people around who are not relaxed about them, who are intransigent, there's not much you can do except try to keep out of their way. Because, as it were, to permit them to hide themselves off, which we do, right? I mean, there are super observant Mennonites in Amish communities in the United States who live in ways that wouldn't be possible if they lived among the rest of us.
Hello, my name's Sophie, and as someone from Northern Ireland, reasons that religion divides us is an issue close to my heart. And I was just really struck by what you were saying there in regards to identity, that as a feminist legal scholar, that Judith Butler's theory on the idea that gender is performative based on our social and cultural norms. And I suppose the question that struck me is, do you also believe that religion is performative? And if so, what the purpose behind it is? In Judith Butler's theory, it's to uphold patriarchal structures of power. So in this instance, what would you say the purpose is?
That's one of the places where I don't think there's a general answer.
Yeah.
It's clear that some religions are centrally preoccupied with maintaining patriarchal power. I mean, that's one of the things that seems evident. And so, but whatever brings something into being and whatever function it has served in the past, we can engage in practices of reform that reduce that. So since the first woman Anglican priest was had her head anointed, had the hands of a bishop laid upon her, and it happens that this was in Hong Kong, we've reached the point where the chair of the Episcopalian, which is what Americans call Anglicans, Episcopalian conference so the top bishop in the United States has been a woman. And that should surprise us because of the strong continuity between Catholicism, Roman Catholicism, and Anglicanism on the question of gendering the priesthood until very recently. So the only married priests in the Catholic Church are married Anglican priests who convert to Catholicism and are permitted to keep their wives, since there's only one thing worse than a married priest, and that's a divorced priest. So I think now I've made some functionalist remarks. I think figuring out what grounds and justifies claims about the function of social practices is a difficult question. And but I think that what we call religions usually are so tied up with social arrangements generally in the past, maybe not now, but in the past. I mean, look, one thing that's happened over the last couple hundred years is a kind of differentiation of religion out from everyday. Where I grew up, you can't really distinguish between religion and everything else, right? Because everything, in our house, we said grace, and and then neighbors every morning when they got up gave some offerings to the god tree, the Nyamija, outside their houses, and so on. And if you'd said to them, so which of the parts of your life are religious and which parts of your life are non-religious, they would have answered you in the sort of way that a monk would answer you, which is, it's a crazy idea. There is now a differentiation in the lives of many contemporary people between their religious lives and their non-religious lives. And that's an important fact about modernity. But it's a new thing. Most of what we call religion. I'm saying what we call religion because I'm not a huge fan of this concept being applied as widely as it is. But we do apply it widely, so I'm just following bad practice. I think that, because of that, all the things that societies needed to do got tied up with what we call religion. So patriarchy, class, and so on. It used to be said that the Anglican Church was the Tory party of prayer, and I don't think that was ever true. But it was true that the Anglicanism was very tied up with the state and with state power and with, Protestantism came to this country because Henry VIII wanted to divorce, roughly. I mean, many other things happened as well. But I don't think the function. Religion performs many social functions. The early sociologists, the people who invented sociology, people like Weber and Simmel and Durkheim and in this country, Tyler, the first professor of anthropology at Oxford, those people thought the study of society sort of was the study of religion because they didn't know how to parse things out. And that was true even though they were living in the first period when a significant part of the intelligentsia was self-consciously not theistic in the West. Tyler was a Quaker, Weber was a raised Protestant, and Durkheim was the grandson and great-grandson of rabbis, so they came from different religious traditions. But they were all Europeans, and they all saw that religion was differentiating out from everyday life. But in order to think about society, they thought you had to think about religion.
it relates to some of the questions you've already been asked, but it strikes me that within every religious community, including my own, that there's a fundamentalist side and a liberal side, and it's from within each religion. I just wondered if you had any comments about that.
Yes, I mean, it's partly going to be a question of how tightly you individuate religions, but certainly I argued in my book on cosmopolitanism that there was plenty of cosmopolitan stuff in Christian, in fact, in the New Testament, in Christian tradition, just as there are a lot of very uncosmopolitan Christians, like those Amish, right? The Amish in Pennsylvania refer to their neighbors. They continue to speak German, already a self-isolating thing, and they refer to their neighbors as die Amerikaner, the Americans. They're not in the cosmopolitan mood, and that's because of the kind of Mennonites that they are. So I agree with you. If you look at nothing more cosmopolitan in a way than the religious attitudes in Al-Andalus under the Muslims. Nothing more cosmopolitan than much of so-called Hindu practice in the past. Nothing more accepting of incredible diversity and willing to live aside people who are doing all sorts of different things from you. And so I agree that, I mean, as you know, there's a sort of literature on fundamentalism which essentially argues that it's a modern phenomenon, that it's a political phenomenon, that what we call, as you know, the word was invented by some Christians in the early 20th century who wanted to go back to what they thought was the fundamentals of Christianity. So it was invented not as a criticism, but as a self-positive term. But we now have that pattern. Well, the most surprising case, I suppose, we have that pattern in Buddhism now, right? In Myanmar and in Sri Lanka, we have uncosmopolitan Buddhists, which you might have thought was a sort of contradiction in terms. So I think something has happened in the modern world, and I think one of the things that's happened is the mobilization of religious identities for political purposes, and when that happens, one of the ways they get mobilized is to divide. But that doesn't mean that there's anything intrinsically divisive about any of these traditions. They can go the other way, and they have gone the other way.
Thank you, fascinating talk. There seems to be a tendency today with religious nationalist groups, I'm thinking particularly like Israeli Zionists and the kind of Hindutva movement in India, to try and sort of insert their idea of the ideal state back into the religion for everybody else. So it creates a sort of enormous pressure on the average Jew or the average Hindu to support obviously the state, and then it kind of makes it difficult to make arguments against some of the bad stuff that they might be doing because you get accused of discriminating against a protected characteristic. So I wonder if you can talk about how we disentangle those sort of arguments and that idea.
Right, so good question. I mean, those are, that's an example of the phenomenon of mobilizing identities that weren't invented for this political purpose in contemporary politics. And so because to the extent that an identity matters to people, mobilizing it to generate solidarity and support is a perennial temptation for political leaders and for political parties and so on. And so what you do is you identify the state with a non-state identity, in this case a religious identity, and then you tell people who don't go along with what the state is trying to do that they're bad Muslims or bad Jews or bad Christians or bad Hindus. Or, of course, in much populism, bad Hungarians or bad Indians or bad Americans, right? So that's another kind of identity. The kind of cultural side of a national identity gets pulled into politics, and you get the sort of thing we had in the United States in the 1950s, where there was something there was a committee of the United States Congress called the Un-American Affairs Committee, right? And people were accused of being un-American. And people went to jail but lost their jobs and so on. It was a horrible period of persecution. So that's a thing that people do with identities. They do it with religious identities if they can get away with it. It's because these traditions have these other resources in them, there are resources within the religious tradition to resist this, right? This is one of the reasons why there has been a disestablishmentarian movement in Anglicanism. It's because they think that too close an association with the state is bad for religion, right? It may be bad for the state too, but it's sort of evidently bad for religion, in part because you get these mobilizations of political identity to bully people into doing what the state wants. But states use anything they can to bully people into doing what they want, right? And so they use religion, but they use other things as well, and they use the psychology of building solidarity by stigmatizing others. They use that mechanism with religious identities, with ethnic identities, with racial identities, and with issues around gender identity and sexuality, right? So many of the populist movements in the world today are deeply homophobic. And that's not contingent, I think. It's because demonizing somebody is a good way of getting us together. And that's, as I say, that's part of the logic of the psychologic or the social psychologic of identity. It's not special to religion. But we do see it in the world today in the use of religions. And that's true, interestingly enough, I think, even though the interpenetration of everyday life by religion that there was in the past is still less. I mean, so Weber's sort of disenchantment has continued to some extent, but it hasn't led to the end of religion. It's led to the creation of a new kind of religious identity, which is different, I think, from the older ones.
Well, I'm afraid we need to draw things to a close there. Apologies to those of you who had questions and didn't get the opportunity to ask them. But let's thank Anthony once again for a fascinating talk.